Long before narrative and storytelling became buzzwords in the technology space, Megan Cunningham was pioneering the art of brand storytelling through her content studio, Magnate Media. But it wasn't easy creating an entirely new media and marketing model and building a global business. Cunningham learned the cost of burning the candle on both ends on a business trip one day.
And the first meeting, I honestly cannot tell you anything that was said during that meeting because I was just like sitting there staring off into space and in such agonizing pain. And by the end of the meeting, I just had to like excuse myself and went to the hotel room and just called 911 because I was like just like doubled over in pain.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chitra Ragavan, and this is When It Mattered. This episode is brought to you by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups find their narrative. Her health crisis convinced Megan Cunningham to acknowledge that scaling a company meant operating at a whole different level, both personally and professionally. Here to talk about it is Megan Cunningham, CEO of the brand studio Magnate Media. Cunningham is a sought-after speaker on media and marketing trends, especially how data informs the storytelling process to drive measurable impact. She's also the author of the book, The Art of the Documentary. And Cunningham has spoken at many events, including the Sundance Film Festival, the Wharton School of Business, South by Southwest, and the Consumer Electronics Show. Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
What did you want to be when you grew up? Did you want to be doing what you're doing now?
When I was younger, I was really fortunate to be immersed in a house that just loved to tell stories. We have a really close family and everyone's really a pretty obsessive reader, but we also love to exchange stories. And that was a big part of my life growing up. And so when it came to decide, what I wanted to be, of course, I naturally gravitated towards writing. However, after researching all the schools that I could potentially go to and looking into the writing programs and visiting campuses, I chose Swarthmore, and yet when I signed up for my first year of courses, the very first class I took was called Women in Documentary. And ironically, it was from a visiting professor who was there from NYU and had a film background. And so I quickly sort of pivoted paths as an 18-year-old and decided that visual storytelling was really so much more compelling, and that's what I was drawn to.
What drew you so much towards video and film, and what were the things in that class that shaped the work you subsequently did?
Yeah, so I grew up in a really small town, and like many of us in the States, it was really isolated and sheltered. And so I think, the exposure that I gained from this course that was showing so many independent films from throughout history was really eye-opening and transformative in so many ways. We watched work from different decades and from overseas, and it was just, at that time, there wasn't a huge amount of opportunity. Cable television was really just on the rise. And so there wasn't a diversity of storytellers. And so that exposure to new people's experiences and sort of ways of looking at the world was very moving to me. And I thought, this is how we could create a more empathetic world if we understood each other and where everyone was coming from. So that I felt, sort of politically aligned to, as well as artistically drawn to.
And there were a lot of conversations that were going on at the time that were, sort of the social activism that was starting, right, with like Black Lives Matter and things like that.
Yeah, this was definitely before all of that was formalized. And this was, probably like the second wave of feminism in the 90s. And, at that point, I think there was, we'd just come out of a sort of Reagan-Bush era of, a lot of divisiveness, not unlike the era we're currently in, but where people, weren't really able to listen to each other ever or interested in listening to each other. And so there was this, what I saw in the power of storytelling was an ability to understand someone else's experience in a way that you couldn't simply through reading about it or from conversation.
So what did you do next?
So I was fortunate enough to have my name pulled from a hat, and it was in that class. A subset of us were actually selected because there was an abundance of interest, and so a subset were selected to work on a grassroots documentary with our professor. And fast forward the clock, it ended up winning a Student Emmy Award, and so. A year later, we find ourselves in like this fancy LA studio sitting next to the, MTV executives. And, it was really this crazy amount of opportunity that came at all of us very early on. And thinking, I'm 20 years old, I've made it, So that part of it was obviously very deceiving, that like, this is how things work. Like you just, you get lucky and then you work really hard and stay up in the morning editing this video, and suddenly, your career is set for you. But I think, I did have that good fortune early on, and it was also, through a lot of collaboration and sort of ironing out, the sort of creative details that we all sort of felt were, important to the project. And it happened to be about AIDS activism at the time.
And so you then ended up at, what was your first real career opener? Was it PBS?
Yeah, so I worked in public television and at WNET and as well as HBO, and a number of independent films that were, made for both those channels, where the companies would have, sort of working space at the networks because they had these long sort of output deals. And, initially I was like in my glory. It was so humbling to be around, the filmmakers and editors and producers whose work I had watched, again, obsessively for the past 4 years. And to get to see how they, woke up at 4 a.m. to, get the crew ready to be on set and, have every little detail in, ironing the carpet that was like in the way background of the shot, so that, everything could just be perfect in the image. That level of discipline and craftsmanship, I think, was awe-inspiring, and still, I take those lessons with me to this day. However, the downside was that the pace I found to be agonizing. I mean, it would take 3 to 5 years to go from a concept to research to a place where grants were, submitted, or you were pitching investors or networks that would commission, sort of episodes of different ongoing programs like America Undercover or American Experience. And so that process, I just found like, wow, it's going to take like my entire lifetime to make like, 3 or 4 films. And I just wanted to move faster. I was much more impatient, I guess, than a lot of the other colleagues I worked with. And so one of my mentors at the time, Larry Silk, who was, just a legend in documentary editing, took me out to lunch and said, Megan, you are really creative, really hardworking. And I, was like sitting straight up in my seat and thinking, oh, finally somebody's noticing. And, and he said, however, everyone else here is also very hardworking and very creative. So he's like, the thing that makes you stand out is you're good at computers. And I thought, because I thought, he was going to tell me that I had like this really unique, sort of, narrative style or something in my, editing approach. And instead it was this, sort of vocational technical skill that he saw that was a real differentiator for me. But at the time, I went home and I was, bummed out, and I thought about it. I said, and I had 2 conclusions from that conversation. And one was, if I'm the most technical person, having graduated from a liberal arts college and grown up in a house where my mother was an English teacher, we're all in trouble in the media industry. And the second was, I really should lean into this. This is someone who I admire and who, has mentored a lot of impressive people. And I'm wondering what I can do with the technology side that can be a source of passion for me as much as the storytelling and creative side was. And so with that, I was scanning the classifieds, which were a thing at the time. And I found a role that said ground floor opportunity to join a startup as employee number 2. And again, this was, in the late 90s, and not a lot of people were part of startups, certainly not on the East Coast. And so a lot of my friends at the time thought, do you have a real job? Like, there's not a lot of people on that floor that you work on, you're going to money or something, like, what's happening? And it turned out that it was a massive opportunity for me to build this company. I was at the right hand of a serial entrepreneur and hired 40 people over 3 years, and we bootstrapped it and became this $20 million company. And so I really learned a tremendous amount, not just about the technology, but also about sort of building a company.
And so what were your plans afterwards?
At that point, I had, been working, 2, 3, 4 years on this really ridiculous schedule, like most startups. And, I was putting in, 7 days a week and 60 hours, and it was just so exhausting. And I thought, I don't think there's a light at the end of the tunnel if I stay here. And so I really wanted to return to the creative storytelling part as well. Like, part of my goal in taking that job was to get much more confident on the technology side. And, by the end of that period, we had built studios for Woody Allen and Oprah and MTV. And so it was all about this digital transformation. So I felt very, very confident that I knew what I was talking about when it came to the technical side. However, I really had a yearning to be both, sort of maintain that technology edge, but really have a creative component to my work. And so at the time, I, was telling the founder I'm, going to leave, and I, was thinking about it. 6 months from now, I'm going to sort of exit the company. And, he was supportive of that. He knew how hard I had worked, but he said, you're not going to go work for some filmmaker, are you? And, he was a very persuasive person. And at the time, like, that had been in my head. I was like, wow, I made all these great connections. I could go, put together some, independent project, but it sounded so small when he described it that I thought, no, I can't go work for some filmmaker. And so he really urged me to roll up my sleeves and start Magnate Media at the ripe old age of 27.
That's amazing. As we know with startups, it's not just the idea, but the timing of that idea that can make or break you. If you're too early or if you're too late, you just can't succeed in the market, right? The market timing is exquisite and unforgiving. Did that in any way impact your business, given that you were starting it, at a very early stage of the age of the internet?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the reality is I'm really an accidental entrepreneur in many ways. It wasn't my life's dream to run a company. However, I did have a very strong vision for the way in that the world could be, which was, still to this day, our mission is telling stories that matter so that we have a more empathetic, inclusive world. And, we do that through, branded content. But I will say that that vision wasn't something that any other company was doing. They was, I was sort of had this, grand view of creating almost an alternative media industry with fewer gatekeepers, that was more open and diverse, and that, was supportive of, it was a for-profit organization, but it was supportive of a broader set of stories that couldn't have been told through the traditional channels. And so we were a pioneer in a lot of different facets of the industry. We were a pioneer of web video. We were a pioneer of branded content. Social and streaming distribution were things that we were talking about, in the early 2000s. We were fortunate enough to have Apple as our first client. So that, set us up for success and sort of gave us some gas in the tank and some assurance that we weren't completely delusional. But at the time, you make a really good point here, because I think that no one can predict what the horizon of your success is going to be. And when a trend is on target, how long it will take for that trend to truly be monetizable. And so I think that, that's the biggest unknown and the biggest risk factor in so many startups is, we needed all these underlying market conditions in order for the company to be successful. So we needed there to be, social networks, that we needed broadband to be ubiquitous. We needed mobile to be, a means of capturing and exchanging content. In order to really reach scale, those facts had to all come to fruition. And in the early 2000s, those were a pipe dream, right? YouTube wasn't around until 2005. And, mobile phones and social networks, came after that. So I think that those evolutions were things that, I knew from understanding the technology and the direction that things were headed, that those were inevitabilities. But what I didn't and wasn't able to predict was the timing.
And also YouTube at the time, I guess, even when it happened in the early days, certainly wasn't kind of this marketing engine that it was. And I think you came in that early period and were able to capitalize on it when it did become a marketing engine.
Yes, no, thank you for saying that. And it wasn't, I'd love to say that, yes, I saw YouTube and I said, this is the turning point for Magnate Media. But, in retrospect, it really was. But at the time, it took, someone at Google who was well connected and had an ear to the ground and knew of a little company called Magnate Media that was like, 6 or 7 people at the time in Manhattan. And they called me up and they said, we hear that you can tell brands that we're more than cat videos. And I remember, sort of being on YouTube at the time as I had, sort of the phone to my ear and saying, the homepage is all cats right now. I'm not sure that's true, but I can help you make it more than cat videos. And so, we put our heads together and did some really exciting projects in the early days to showcase to the leading creative directors who were really invested in television spots that, the web was not just user-generated low-end video, but that it had all these possibilities of brilliant storytelling.
So now that Magnate Media was on a roll, you had a different set of challenges to grow and to scale. And at one point, it was so challenging that it almost brought you down health-wise. What happened?
Yeah, so it's funny. I just came across the itinerary from that trip. I was cleaning out a closet that I didn't realize had some old files. But this was less than 10 years ago, actually, that we were in a very high growth period. We were hiring a number of people and I still was wearing a number of hats myself. And we had just signed with a Hollywood agent, which is really exciting. And they had lined up 30 meetings for me in 3 days. And, I was really pushing them to max out the calendar because I was only going to be in LA for, 72 hours. I wanted to meet everybody. We had all these brilliant ideas. And as I was on the flight, I remember feeling like, I was going through all the preparation materials. And I remember feeling like I was getting really hot. And all of a sudden I was looking down at my laptop and I'm like, wow, it's really hot in here. And I went to the restroom and I felt like I was going to pass out. And when we landed, I just was okay, I was splashed water on my face. I'm okay, I'm just going to go to these meetings. That was just a weird moment. And the first meeting, I honestly cannot tell you anything that was said during that meeting. So I was just sitting there staring off into space and in such agonizing pain. And by the end of the meeting, I just had to excuse myself and went to the hotel room and just called 911 because I was just doubled over in pain. And it turned out that I had a number of different, minor, what turned out to be fortunately very minor health issues, but it was really scary. And I was in the hospital for a week and, visited by the head of surgery and they were, my agent sent me flowers and it was this whole thing of oh my God, am I, not going to make it to 40 here? It's a crazy amount to sacrifice. And at the time I was really, in that same startup mode that any founder is still, where it's you'll do it's whatever it takes, right? You'll do anything to make it a success. It's really the only thing that matters. And, I believe it takes a lot of that drive and commitment to make something successful, to make a company from nothing. But I learned the hard lesson in that example that, there are moments where you really have to take a step back and say, okay, if this is the only way to be successful, then, I can't sacrifice my life for the success of the company. Something has to change. And so as it turned out, my husband was in Northern California for a board meeting for his company that same week. And he flew down and was very concerned. Obviously, I was sitting there with my IVs and, sleeping most of the day. And we just sat there, and it was like an intervention. He was just like, you can't keep working these hours. And we had our son had just been born. And so he was, really young at the time. And, he was calling me on FaceTime and being like, Mommy, why aren't you coming home? And it was just, it was all these sort of reality checks in the fact that that pace that I was trying to keep of sleeping on 4 or 5 hours of a night and, doing a gazillion different jobs, it wasn't realistic. And so in that phase, I really rewrote the business plan and said, if we restructured the company so that there's a lot more autonomy that my very talented team could take on, what would this look like? And in that sort of organizational redesign was the next chapter of Magnate Media, which we still has brought us to this day.
That's amazing. When you were talking about your husband talking to you and your son being worried about you, I was just reading this morning about the uproar over the Silicon Valley CEO who had put out this incredible request for a nanny who was like a miracle worker, and there's all this debate of what do women want, working women want. And I read this great column in the Washington Post that talked about the emotional cost of labor, right? It's like all of this hidden stuff that women do that we don't get paid for. And you were not only an executive, but you also were a mom and a wife and a homemaker at the time. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, it was, I do believe that women have a number of responsibilities. I believe that any founder with a family has a number of responsibilities that are very difficult to juggle. But I should also note, just for the record, that I have had, since Jack was born, an absolutely incredible nanny and the support of my parents and my husband's parents. And, we both have incredible brothers. So, we have a really amazing support network. And even with all that support, I think it's still incredibly challenging.
Definitely. So where is the whole media industry headed now, would you say, in terms of content marketing and video and storytelling? Every day there's change. Every day there's disruption. Where are we going?
This is one of my favorite all-time questions. So thank you for asking, Chitra. But I think, reflecting back, we're going to be 20 years old next year. And I will say that, the last 2 decades has probably been the most disruptive that the media industry has ever seen. And in those disruptions, advertising has become increasingly blocked, skipped, and avoided, while stories are searched for, discovered, enjoyed, and shared socially. And so it's this interesting dichotomy where throughout companies' history, legacy and incumbent companies, these large enterprises, they're still often scratching their head on digital transformation. Their teams don't think in, sort of social and mobile first ways. Their communications are, fairly dated traditionally, where, it's more about like press releases and billboards and, media mentions and things than it is around really owning the story and producing original content. But what we're seeing is that more and more the brands that are fastest moving and taking full advantage of all of these distribution channels are true storytellers. They are really the ones that understand that putting forth filmmaking and blogs and podcasting and streaming series and working with influencers and designing immersive experiences, that all of those touch points that you could potentially have with your community of customers is the gold that makes a brilliant brand and, frankly, a sustainable company.
I think it becomes even more necessary today when you look at, we're all at the mercy of algorithms. And if you look at how Facebook has changed its algorithm, for instance, to favor person to person communication and storytelling as opposed to corporate advertising and marketing, it becomes all the more important, I think, for companies to figure out how do we work around these changes. How do we play with these algorithms and be able to still get our message out?
Absolutely. And I think that aspect of how to get the message out is so critical because it really comes down to both the art and science of modern marketing. The art is really around thinking through consumer insights and what's really having the pulse of the culture. And the science is understanding how do you now take those story ingredients and form a story along the lines that will be shared socially or discovered through search. So if you understand both the search dynamics and the social climate and how to kind of tap into those key distribution channels, I think that's a winning combination.
And I think one of the interesting things you told me earlier was that brands have to be patrons of culture in a weird way. They need to be able to tap into what's affecting people at an emotional level, and culture is one of it.
Absolutely. I think, I just got back from Davos, as you know, and we were talking about this earlier. And one of the things that was so, frankly, inspiring to me was that while, the prior year's average age was, something in the late 60s or early 70s even, and was largely white and male, this year there definitely was a movement towards increasing diversity, and they have a long way to go. So I don't want to claim any victory, but I will definitely say that it felt very earnest to me in terms of leaders who were, really shedding a lot of the, sort of closed door meetings and, sort of private brokering of power, and instead were making themselves much more available and having transparent conversations, in some cases very difficult conversations that I'm sure they didn't want to be having in public, around the state of their company or their own career decisions. But they were open to being challenged, and it was really refreshing to see that kind of opening up of access to power.
Looking back, what are your closing thoughts on who you were and what you have become and the work that you're doing today?
It's interesting. I mean, I still feel like I have a lot of things to do. So hopefully this isn't an achievement award type of retirement speech here. I think, my greatest, I feel like, on a personal level, I will say that, the support system of my family and friends and my team has been my greatest fortune. Every moment that was, just heartbreaking or, a devastating setback. And, frankly, in the early days, we had them, once an hour. I felt like it was a victory when those only happened once a month after many years. But you'll always have, sort of these disappointments when you're doing something really ambitious. And so having that system of support with my friends and my family and my team has always been, so gratifying and so fortunate. And my mentors, having Alex Uhas teach that women in documentary class, having Larry Silk really be, such a wise mentor in the editing, from the editing room, and seeing what I could not see in the possibilities of my future on the technology side. But I think that, ultimately this movement towards storytelling, it's just getting started. I mean, we, for years have largely been a video first company. And over the last 6 months, we've launched 4 original podcasts. And so, we're always students of the business, and I think trying to bring a beginner's mind to every new year, to, what's hot and different, and kind of allow our clients to stand out and really catch a wave of new interest. I'm really fascinated by TikTok right now. I think it's taking over the mobile attention of Generation Z and increasingly millennials and even Gen X. So there's all these new platforms and new mediums, and to me, just getting to explore and enjoy the possibilities of those storytelling formats is really a privilege.
Megan, thank you so much for joining me and for the fascinating conversation.
I appreciate being a guest on your terrific show. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Megan Cunningham is CEO of the brand studio Magnate Media. Cunningham is a sought-after speaker on media and marketing trends, especially how data informs the storytelling process to drive measurable impact. She's the author of the book, The Art of the Documentary, and she has spoken at many events, including the Sundance Film Festival, the Wharton School of Business, South by Southwest, and the Consumer Electronics Show. This is When It Mattered. I'm Chitra Ragavan. Thank you for listening to When It Mattered. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars, leave a review, and do recommend it to your friends, family, and colleagues. When It Mattered is a weekly leadership podcast produced by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups find their narrative. For questions, comments, and transcripts, please visit our website at goodstory.io or send us an email at podcast@goodstory.io. Our producer is Jeremy Kaur, founder and CEO of Executive Podcasting Solutions. Our theme song is composed by Jack Yeagerline. Join us next week for another edition of When It Mattered. I'll see you then.